Welcome to Cypher After Hours, where we continue the discussion about today's subject, which is the Skinwalker Ranch. We're going to get a little bit more into some of the more speculative details, some of our personal thoughts on the subject beyond our remote viewing data, as well as, I think one of the key things we're going to talk about is this idea of, is the show itself that is taking place and being recorded at Skinwalker Ranch a form of soft disclosure? Is it a psyop? I think we're going to go down several rabbit holes here in the after hours. So I think with that, I know, Emily, you have some specifics you wanted to get into. Why don't you take us away?
Yeah, I wanted to start off with maybe backing up to the bigger picture and really just ask the question, what are we dealing with here? Is this one phenomenon? Is it, as David said, where there's this time-traveling creation that is causing a ripple effect? Or is it the case that there was this inception event, this occurrence, and then other things are taking advantage of this? Other non-physical and maybe physical beings are moving in and kind of dogpiling on top of this really strange situation. And do these things get explained through one phenomenon or a multitude of phenomenon that are all kind of piling into one place? I think we should unpack that. And then I think we should go into a little bit about, let the audience know, Brett, your message that you received from the being. So did you want to start us off with the message? Let's not keep everyone in suspense, and then we'll jump into a bit of the high level phenomenon.
I think, I'm happy to share that kind of last tidbit that I got from the ERV session. When I was there in the center in that perception position, and I was sensing the emotional state of this life form. It had a very inquisitive kind of response to what was going on around in the local environment. I got the sense that there were other agencies, and that's what all those eyeballs up in the sky were, so to speak, keeping an eye on what was going on at this very strange location. Other agencies that may or may not be human are trying to, if anything crazy or anything strange goes on in this location, we want to know about it. And there's a lot of interacting and trying to poke and prod. This is something that's come up on the TV show that they're trying to do. Well, the only way we can understand it is by, we got to poke the beehive. And I got this impression that was communicated to me from this life form of, why in the world would you do that? And it gave me a visual. Imagine you could miniaturize a nuclear reactor and you putting that nuclear reactor into the hands of a child who has no idea what the consequences, has no idea what the ramifications are of poking and prodding a nuclear reactor. And that was the vibe that I was getting from this being is, why are you doing this? First of all, it was just bewildered that agencies, not just human, but there appears to be seemingly other agencies that are not related to those who own the ranch or have the deed to the land that are messing with it. But why would you do that? Because you're going to have some negative unintended consequences. And so I couldn't understand why. And the message that it had is, it said to me directly, I heard it very clearly in the ERV session. It said, tell them to stop. They need to stop. And them just seems to be like a blanket statement to anyone that would interact with it or try and mess with it, that it needs to stop. So, David, I know you had a thought on this.
I just really hope that everybody messing with it is subscribing to our after hours chat so that they can receive the important message. You could send them a crazy 10-page long handwritten letter and use every last bit of the paper and say, I remote viewed and the aliens gave me a message for you.
Oh dear. Yeah, no, I don't assume to have any control over what's going on, nor do I believe that me ERVing it and discussing it here will have an effect. But it was interesting to hear that from the actual life form itself, that it's very disturbed and confused about why these children are messing with something that's like a nuclear reactor. Like, what are you doing? It just felt like its perception was you're all really stupid. That was all. Stop messing with me. And I think just due to the inquisitive nature of human beings and perhaps other things out there, that's likely not going to happen.
Yeah, well, we've definitely seen in the TV show that the people are intentionally prodding it. They're poking the hornet's nest, so to speak, and they've already experienced negative consequences. Now the question is, are those negative consequences from this particular device being that you saw in your ERV session, or are there, as we were mentioning earlier, possibly other entities or beings that have malintent kind of dogpiling onto this particular strange situation and are being almost invited in to cause mayhem or mischief? David, what are your thoughts on that as they relate to sort of a trickster entity, perhaps, or trickster entities in this space?
Well, just going back to the message, the phrase it's wanted to stop being poked and prodded, I think it says in the transcripts, Brett. And that immediately made me think of the ETV show where they were drilling into the mesa and quite literally poking it and prodding it. So we don't know. Are we talking about that kind of very literal poking and prodding, which you can see if that's advanced technology and somebody's ramming a drill into it? It would be reasonable for them to say, would you please stop it? Is that what it's talking about, or is it talking about something much broader? As to the trickster effect and trickster entities, like the nature of the whole phenomenon is like that. There was a Jesse Michaels video and touches on it saying like every time you try and prove it, there's a boulder in the way, or our phones were dead, or just circumstances always arise such that you don't collect good evidence of it, even though there's all these people claiming to have these experiences, and there is some evidence emerging in the form of the injuries as well as the stories and the data they're gathering. But this is exactly like the UFO phenomenon or the UAP, whatever it is, that phenomenon, where there's no there's barely any really good evidence. And it's always, oh, this happened and that happened and that happened. Can you prove it? Hell no. There's not a scrap. But equally, people are having these experiences and they're plausible people and they're not lying and they're embarrassed about sharing these experiences because then everybody will think they're crazy. They're not falsifying this, but it happens in such a way where it doesn't allow hard evidence to be generated.
That's a very good point. It does very much seem like instead of it being a passive phenomenon, that there's an active consciousness behind this particular series of phenomenon that is almost playing like a real-time strategy game or a chess match where the humans or even the other potentially non-physical entities move in and they make a move, and then this consciousness that seems to be in control of the situation is reacting and not only reading the intent and the minds of the individuals that are acting in the ranch, but they're also predicting what might happen and trying to stay one step ahead of them. There's definitely this. I get the sense that there's an intelligence at work that is that's interacting with these people, and that's partially coming across as a trickster entity.
Well, I don't know. I think I have another way of looking at it, which, I'm not saying that one or the other is true, but if you look at broader phenomena like synchronicities and indeed like remote viewing or tarot cards or magic in the more traditional occult sense, there is a way in which events converge upon an outcome. And it's not really ever clear what those events are going to be or what they are or how this outcome is going to come about, such as, I hit my remote viewing target, for example. Nobody knows how that works. But at some point, you sit down and you produce this document, and at some point in the future, you get feedback and put the two and two together and it matches. And it is completely unknown how that happens. We know how to do it well, but we don't know why. We don't know if anything is happening. Maybe nothing is happening. So if you look look at it atemporally. So if you take it out of linear time, so instead of having somebody playing a real-time strategy game, you've got events are gonna pan out this way for reasons which exist outside of time, or a logic which exists outside of linear time as we're in it. So it's more like this is what's going to happen. And one of the things that's not going to happen is a UFO landing on the White House lawn and everyone going, see, they're real. That's not going to happen. And therefore, the way these events take place is in such a way that that kind of hard evidence is
I
not
think one of the
generated.
other angles that we haven't really acknowledged about this that just came to my mind was, can the life form that we were perceiving even be trusted? It seemed very much like it had something to say when I was interacting with it, but it didn't really say why, other than it's dumb. Would you play with a nuclear reactor? And what if it's not being truthful? What if actually messing with it would give away the thing it's trying to achieve? And it doesn't, and if we became more aware about exactly what it was or how it functioned, that it would mess up its own agenda, which may simply be just getting home, not that it would actually be dangerous. Now, I think you got to give it some credit because there have been injuries already that have been documented. So I don't think it's pulling a complete about face or manipulation game. But what if it's not being fully truthful? Just like, well, this kind of maybe segues into one of our other topics I know we wanted to discuss, which is the show even being fully truthful? Is the intent behind the TV show being upfront and honest about what it actually is about?
I think on the surface level, regardless of whether there's a deep hidden agenda or a great conspiracy involving the deep state and fake disclosure, and aside all of that stuff, I think there is at the very least a huge layer of over dramatization. I watched season 3, episode 11, because it is a brilliant summary of all the interesting bits of the preceding 3 seasons. So thank you very much, Emily, for wading through all of those so that you've managed to find the summary. Um, and in there, they were watching an infrared CCTV camera, and there is what is clearly a bug flying around on it. And there's a phenomenon with those video systems called ghosting, where objects leave trails. And there's just a fly flying around, and they're like, it's an orb! Look, it's leaving a trail of energy behind it. The orb. It can't be an insect. Look at the trail. And then, after saying it can't be an insect, right at the end of that clip of video, 2 bugs fly past in the foreground of the camera and leave massive trails of ghosting behind them really clearly, and it's just a technical. And these guys either are total charlatans or they are knowingly over-egging stuff that is not. They also there was a clip of video of the sky and something which looked exactly like a satellite flew past, and they went, "That's too fast to be a satellite." And I'm like, "It's not." I saw a bunch of the Starlink satellites go past the other night, and they go really fast. They blink in and they blink out when they go out of the sunlight. If you catch them just after sundown, and it looked like it probably was one of those satellites. So they're claiming this really innocuous stuff is supporting or corroborating the weird stuff, and that casts doubt over all of it from the off for me.
Yeah, I certainly have my own doubts. They like to use the term the science. I don't know if most serious scientists would call what is happening there science. They also use the term experiments and the data, and they constantly just hammer home experiments, the data, the science. And while they are using equipment to measure things, it doesn't seem like the most rigorous experiment. At least not what would be considered science by serious scientists.
It's almost like if you say it often enough, it will become true. Everybody will half remember it and go, yeah, they had science and they had data and experiments. They had all those things. Those orbs, they must be real.
Right, which leads us into, is this a psychological operation? Is it a psychological operation that is designed to, in the minds of the people who don't really understand what science is, because I think a large majority of people don't, somehow legitimize strange phenomenon, specifically the strange phenomenon going on at Skinwalker Ranch, in terms of then also opening the door to other types of strange phenomena that might occur elsewhere, because they do bring in videos, for example, of the famous Tic Tac UFO, and give credence to it and say how legitimate and wonderful it is that the benevolent American armed forces have said that this is real and given us this footage, and isn't it fantastic? So there does seem to be an element of soft disclosure, and I think maybe we can touch on that a little bit.
My impression of it is actually a little different from that. I mean, maybe there is an aspect of that. I wouldn't rule it out, but the intuitive feeling that I had about the show was that if there's something going on there, that it's like a muddying of the waters or a smoke screen, because something is happening in that location, right? I think we can agree something is happening there that is interesting. Um, but I almost feel like all of this speculative stuff that they're putting out on the orbs and the Tic Tac and Linda Moulton Howe turning up to advise them and all of this stuff that's going on is very. There's loads of things. They don't fit together properly. It's all a mystery. Half of it's probably fake, or at least massively overstated. Like the bugs and the satellites are now evidence of this stuff, for example. And if you just say loads of things and some of them are lies and it's sort of some of them are maybe true and it's just muddying the waters completely. So if you were doing a well, I don't know, some kind of mysterious operation there, some government three-letter agency, secret aircraft development or military technology development or something, and you want to test it out, right? So what better place to hide it than in plain sight? If you're going to do something that's impactful, people are going to see it, they're going to put it on the internet. So if you bring all the scientists and the rockets and the GPS, LiDAR, laser beams, everything there, and you own that circus, you're then controlling the narrative and preventing anybody coming and going like, I saw this. That was what happened, because you've just added so much noise to it that it makes it impossible to differentiate the signal. Maybe, big maybe, but
Piggybacking
that
on
was
that
my hunch.
idea of, it seems like we're potentially dealing with some sort of an obfuscation. I think it's, I just watched a video recently by Richard Dolan, who I think is awesome. He always presents a very intelligent way of assessing and looking at this subject from as grounded approach, I think, as you could possibly have. There's a lot of people that don't do that, but he did a video recently on, hey, UFOs didn't just start in the year 2000. And so when we're getting these videos from the Pentagon or from the oh so gracious US military, oh, thank you for validating that this phenomenon is real for us with 2 or 3 really poor quality videos, I'm sure you don't have anything else. That to me is nonsense. They would have had videos and evidence of this going far back. How come they haven't released that? How come there's so much that's being held back, and why? And for me, it's very clear that it's an intentional rollout to control the narrative. And if we take this show as potentially being part of that narrative control, could it be that the truth of the reality is far greater, and they know it's far greater, that they'd have to use UFOs as the cover to put the truth of the matter behind that so people won't go there? Is that it's actually that wild that UFOs is closer down to Earth than, well, look at our remote viewing data, is we're dealing with time travel. Like, what if they know that? Because there's a lot of, and this is something that did come up in my ERV session. I got the sense that this thing had already really been manipulated and messed with. Like, there are all these wires, just like there were wires pulled out of this device, and a lot of interacting had been done with this thing already. And then it's like, well, I guess we've done all we can. Let's leave. And what did they do? I guess on the show, they're discovering that the entire mesa was, or at least part of the mesa that would open up into where this thing is, was demoed, and they crash all the rocks down. So yes, so benevolent of these groups that they are hiding their tracks as best they can, and now they're using the UFO narrative to cover their tracks? Is that what's actually happening? I ultimately I don't know, but I think it's worth being skeptical because when I watched the first couple episodes of the show, I thought the whole thing was actors, bad actors. Like, is this you're telling me the producers didn't know what they were doing when they put together that first season of the show? That they knew exactly what they were doing. They knew exactly that how do we get people wrapped up in this reality TV drama. And it's not lost on me the fact that our remote viewing data is insanely out of this world. We're talking about time traveling aliens, and then we're poo pooing a little bit on this subject of the quote unquote researchers there that seem to not really be doing in depth research. To me, it seems like that there's narrative control going on because there's a bigger agenda at play, and this is one avenue with which they can kind of release this information, UFO information, while perhaps not playing their full hand. And so I think there's a level of dishonesty I think that's going on with this show, which we're already aware of. I think this Travis guy recently, after season 3 came out on an interview with George Knapp, where he said, "Yeah, I basically had to." He didn't use this word, but he essentially had to lie to the show and the producers by omitting the fact that he was part of intelligence in the U.S. government, and he didn't tell them that. And that's just one example of the dishonesty that has already occurred, which he said, well, it's harmless because I got to be on both sides. Well, what other things do you think are harmless that you're withholding? And it makes me highly skeptical. So I guess that's where my current take is, at least.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Brett. I think there's a common pattern in a lot of these misdirection type psyops where there's a grain of truth hidden amongst many lies, or if not outright lies, just over embellished things that are a bit unimportant or nonsensical. And so it makes it very confusing. It's again why it's so important to have discernment to disentangle, because there's an element of this that someone will look at and say, oh well, there's these 3 things that are bogus, therefore I call it the baby with the bathwater, let's just flush this whole thing down, there's nothing to see here, which might be the goal of this psyop, is just delete it from your mind because it's intentionally over the top crazy as a cover for some real phenomenon going on. Or then the flip side of it is the individual consuming this content might just buy everything hook, line, and sinker and be sent off on a red herring down the garden path, down the rabbit hole. I don't know what other metaphor we could use here, but one of those things. And that's not the way we want to go either. So I think it's important to disentangle the fact that it seems like our consensus here on this show is that there is something very unusual about this place. We have some data that corroborates that. It is remote viewing data, but it's something unique and different that other people have not necessarily brought to light up until now. And at the same time, we can be critical of not only our own data, but all the other data that's out there, because I think we have to. I think we have to be skeptical of the stuff we get and the stuff that everyone else gets.
Just going back to just how far out our remote viewing data is on this topic, there's concepts like Jeffrey Mishlove talks about the what is it called, boggle threshold, which is like things can get strange up to a certain point at which you become boggled and you're just like, I just can't take this in. I can't even entertain this idea because it's just too weird. And there's also I think it's Ingo Swann's concept of the reality box. You know, that you've got these models and you can put stuff in them, but some things are too big or too weird that, you know, there just isn't space. So if the reality of Skinwalker Ranch is time traveling aliens from the distant future accidentally punched a hole through space time and allowed all of the weird things to, I'm pretty sure that's the plot of like one of the Doom computer games, isn't it? Or isn't it? Maybe Hell does that or something. But it's that level of, that is way boggle threshold. I am boggled by that, and it is outside my reality box. And you know, you get what you get. The data is what it is, isn't it? But to say, oh, well, we've remote viewed it, so that's what happened. Time traveling aliens, mystery solved. Next. We can't do that. Well, I can't do that. Maybe some people can, but I don't think we should.
There is the obvious question, and that is, so do we not think that a skinwalker is just running amok on this property? I mean, right? But why don't we think that? Because I have some reasons. I'm just curious to know why don't we think that?
Well, we have one eyewitness statement that was featured in the TV show. I hope there are more. Um, and it was extremely similar to the other accounts of cryptid encounters and indeed UFO phenomenon encounters that are out there, which is, oh, I saw this thing and it felt very strange and then it just disappeared.
So I don't think I've shared this with you guys. You just prompted this, David. But I actually personally have had an experience. I don't know if it was a skinwalker or what, but I remember hearing some of the descriptions of skinwalker after I became aware of this phenomenon at the ranch. And what year would this have been? This would have been 2013 when I was living in the high desert in Southern California. If you know the area at all, it's just north of Joshua Tree. It's very high desert. There's very little around there. It's very open. Dirt roads are everywhere. I was renting a little place out there to get away from the city. But it's high desert, so it get really hot. And in the evening, once the sweltering sun would go down, I'd go out and water my plants because I wanted them to not die. I just had a couple plants outside. And I would do that right when the sun would go down behind the mountain. And it would still be very light, but there wouldn't be any direct sunlight. And one evening, I saw something 100 meters away from me. There's a dirt road that was going parallel with the property I was renting. And at first, I thought someone was jogging because but it was strange because they were making these very weird motions with their arms where they're just pumping their arms up and down in a very exaggerated manner. And I was like, well, that's really strange. So I'm looking at it a little bit more intently, a little bit more closely, and I notice it's just a totally black silhouette, which there still was sunlight. I could see everything else fine, but it was a very solid black silhouette of this person seemingly running down the road in a really exaggerated manner. And then I realized this person is running really fast. This is going like the speed of a car. So I thought, is this person standing in the bed of a trunk of a car doing these really weird motions? And why are they wearing a full black outfit? I'm trying to comprehend what I'm seeing here, and it's not really fully making sense. So I watched this maybe for 10 seconds, it just coming from the right side of my vision, going across, and the road continues. There's no offshoot of the road. It's just a straight dirt road, maybe 100 meters in front of me. And there's a big yucca plant right in the middle of the desert that obstructs. It's maybe halfway between where I'm standing, watering my plants, and where the road is, just out in the desert. And it obstructs the view of this person silhouette pumping their arms up and down, seemingly like running exaggerated. It goes behind that yucca tree, and nothing comes out the other side. I'm waiting for it. I'm like, did it stop? It's like I walk towards the yucca tree to kind of to look around the side of the yucca tree, which is blocking the road. Nothing's there. So I'm like, okay, well, I don't know what in the world I just saw, but it was really weird. And here's the kicker to this story is a week later, my neighbor, who she has 2 dogs and like to sit on her back porch in the evening on a different day, not the same day that I saw this thing. She told me, she said to me in the evening one day when I was talking to her, she said, Brett, you're not going to believe me, but I had the weirdest thing happen to me today. And I told her that I did remote viewing. And so she was a little bit more prone to open up to me about talking about some strange experiences. She said, I was sitting on my porch yesterday and this giant figure silhouette, she said, looked 7 feet tall. She said it was maybe 50 feet away from her, appeared out of nowhere at the corner of her eye. She saw it running across the desert. And there's this one little house that's in the distance from where her property is, tiny, tiny little cottage, and nothing else around, just open desert around it. It ran to this little cottage went around the corner of the cottage and disappeared, and it didn't come out any of the other sides. But she said the strange part about it was it had something that looked like a cloak or a long garment that was, she described like no light was catching it. It was just blackness in broad daylight. She said this was like 1 p.m. in the afternoon. There was no light catching on this garment, and it's like this cloak or this piece of fabric kept catching up to it, like it was getting stretched and pulled before the whole thing disappeared. And she was completely terrified afterwards. The dogs didn't make a sound, she said. They didn't bark, which also was a little unusual. But that happened within the same week that I saw something very similar that was very strange that appeared and just disappeared. What in the world that was, I have no idea. I can't corroborate her story. I know she wouldn't lie to me. I definitely saw the nervousness on her face when she was telling this to me. I know I saw that, which was very strange. What is that? I don't know. I've never actually remote viewed it. But when I started hearing some of these stories about skinwalkers, it actually matched somewhat closely to these experiences that I had actually had and heard personally. So I don't know what that means, but it was an interesting tangent that you reminded me of when you were talking.
So there are a lot of reports of people who see cryptids, Bigfoot, dogmen, these sorts of things, and they describe exactly what you just described, Brett, where it's almost like the movements are exaggerated. They look a little bit almost like from a comic cartoon. It's almost cartoonish the way it's like, and it doesn't seem like it can handle. It's not working within physics. Like it moves just like so fast that it doesn't seem real, and yet it's there. And it's just very interesting because that it brought to mind these very common experiences that people have when they see other cryptids. Now, just out of curiosity, did you experience the Oz effect where things go dead silent? You don't hear like crickets, nothing. It's just eerie silence during this experience. Do you recall how the desert sounded at that time?
It's hard to know because it was already just like the evening had started. The sun, there's a giant mountain range in the distance from where I was living. It's the Big Bear mountain range on the other side of LA. And the sun had just gone down past the peaks. And that sense of things quieting down already was there as far as the time of day. If it actually happened, maybe. It's hard for me to know. It was a long time ago. It was almost, gosh, that's like 9 years ago now. So I don't know. I couldn't pinpoint that directly. I know I was definitely stunned and in shock and was like, can I believe my eyes? This is weird. And then I remember like, should I be walking towards this thing to see? And I was like, my curiosity is like, I remember actually saying to myself, you're going to regret not going to the side and going up on the hill to look on the other side of the yucca tree because you can say, well, it just took a left turn. And so I said, okay, I'm going to go towards this thing and see if I could see anything. And nothing was there. It was just gone. So grain of salt. It was just an anecdotal experience, but a strange one, to say the least.
Well, I never heard you tell that story before, Brett, but as soon as you mentioned the yucca tree, I knew exactly what was going to happen, that it was going to disappear behind it. There is something really interesting about this. It just disappears. Was it there in the first place? What perceptual modality are people in when they experience things like this? Um, the Oz effect that Emily mentioned, I mean that can also include like there's no cars on the roads, all the people are gone. It's like everything's stopped and paused, and that's also common in sort of UAP type encounters, isn't it? And like what's really happening there? Do all the people disappear? Are you in a parallel dimension? Is there something going on inside the mind that you keep the context of where you are? Perhaps your mind um can't process the fact that you might be perceiving something completely elsewhere and completely different, maybe even in a different kind of time, whatever that means. And your mind kind of keeps it running. Like, our visual perception is mostly made up by the brain. We don't really see very much with our eyes. Like, if you look dead ahead of you right now and then perceive in your peripheral vision, you can see colors there, but you barely have any color sensing cells in your peripheral vision. Your brain's just making it up, basically. You're blind every time your eyes move, and they move constantly. There's so many hacks that the brain does. We think we can see and we can hear and we can feel. It is an illusion of coherence created within the sensory apparatus of the brain. So if something really weird happened to your perception or to what you were perceiving, the brain is running this constant model of reality because, so the theory goes, it's more energy efficient to just model reality than it is to perceive it all at once. So if something really, really strange happens to your inputs, the brain, I guess, could just freewheel, couldn't it? It could keep going. It's like, well, I was out watering my garden. I damn well must still be here. I was driving my car. I must still be driving my car, not getting more input, but can't be anywhere else, right? That's not how reality works.
There's one thing that I think I remember doing now that I'm talking about it and remembering. I think I actually held my breath when I was watching it. I remember first noticing it, and then once I noticed it and something just felt off or strange, I held my breath until it disappeared. So I don't know if that means anything, but that's what I'm recalling doing.
Or maybe you didn't hold your breath. Maybe that experience happened somehow outside of your body or outside of time. And what was actually happening was the part of you having that experience or the experience itself didn't take up any time at all. So you didn't notice yourself breathing, or you noticed that you weren't breathing because you weren't, because you weren't really there.
So, bringing this conversation back to the show topic of Skinwalker Ranch, there's a counterpoint. So, while I think it's an interesting consideration that maybe this is a psychological phenomenon, there is leftover physical evidence on Skinwalker Ranch in these situations where they had creatures. I think they were alpacas. They brought them on to the ranch. They were attacked by, of course, a large dog-like being that was just off camera, and the camera malfunctions, of course. However, the alpacas were genuinely injured. The injuries were visible, and they had to call a vet in, and then the alpacas had to leave. The Shermans, I believe, one of the previous owners, were reporting that large wolf-like beings were coming in to attack creatures they had, dogs and cows. Cows went missing, dogs went missing, animals died. I know these things happen on ranches on a regular basis. However, they coincided with reports of these strange cryptids. So you have, beyond just the potentially psychological element, a very physical repercussion from this event that can be measured and looked at well after the fact, including this. I believe the one cow that died that they were showcasing in the TV show actually had bizarre radiation associated with it, as well as bizarre electromagnetic phenomenon associated with the carcass. So these things do have some physical touch points.
What if the physical evidence and the perceptual experience of these events are completely isolated from each other? What if these are very strange, unknown phenomena which have inexplicable physical effects, and then people have these perceptual experiences which are never backed up by video evidence, or nobody's ever shown me a Polaroid of a skinwalker, because these experiences just don't seem to happen in a video recordable way. But I've got I wouldn't go quite so far as to say belief, but I have a strongly held hunch that aliens, cryptids, Bigfoot, leprechauns, elves, fairies, I don't know, whatever, all of that weird stuff that goes bump in the night is the same phenomena. Because you look at the UFO phenomena, it it reflects the culture of the people who are experiencing it. In the 50s, the spacemen wear like diving suits with big helmets on and stuff, and then there's like localized things that it's really culturally specific how people experience it. And it's like, obviously, there's a phenomenon going on, but then the way that it's perceived by whoever bumps into the phenomenon is like a big reflection of what's inside that individual's experience, and maybe even what their fears are, or just what movies they've seen, perhaps. Gray aliens become a much bigger trope once Spielberg starts filling everybody's heads with that imagery, right?
So that definitely agree with you in that I think that many of these phenomenon could be related in ways that we don't understand. I have spent a lot of time listening to eyewitness accounts of various kinds of cryptids, and I do feel like these phenomenon are layered on top of each other or intertwined. There is some aspect to that I think goes on in terms of people see what they want to see or what's perceived in sort of the popular culture and the zeitgeist. However, I've heard more experience encounters that people have recounted where they have no idea. They it's not even on their radar. They don't they openly will say, I didn't believe in any of this stuff. I thought it was all crazy until this thing happened. And then I started looking into it and oh my gosh, I saw this type of a cryptid or whatever. Right. And it's almost more those accounts that I would have some sort of a mark of credibility with. I don't want to discount anyone's experience. If somebody's experienced a creature and they're into researching these creatures and they happen to have that experience, that's their experience. And I'm sure that, I'm not trying to deny that. However, I personally, looking at it as sort of more of a skeptical take, I'm looking at these individuals who had no reason to make this up. They wasn't even on their radar, and all of a sudden they saw something really weird, and now they're talking about it. Usually decades after they've experienced it because of the trauma, the sense of ridicule. There's no upside because many of these people, if they'd talked when they were at the time of the experience, they would have lost friends, family, jobs, and so I don't really see the motivation there to make that up. And then consequently, I don't see, okay, maybe it's some sort of subconscious effect. I don't see that it's necessarily tied to their subconscious. There may be a collective zeitgeist effect going on. I don't know.
I think it's an interesting idea. What if the phenomenon is something that our brain can't compute? So the reason why it's so strange in the perception of those eyewitnesses is because it's the brain doing its best job to give you something when there's nothing to give that makes any sense. And so is that why you see a strange creature, or like what I saw was this silhouette of a strange looking tall person? Maybe it's a bit of both though. Maybe it's a little bit of that and it's a little bit of, well, yeah, there is something there that it just didn't register. Are we dealing with something like that? I mean, I think there's a phenomenon even in astronomy where it's like, well, once we realize it's there, we find it everywhere. But until we realize it's there, it doesn't seem to show up for us. So maybe it's something like that too. I don't know.
I think a metaphor for that kind of effect could be language in itself. Um, what is love, right? And now I've got that song stuck in your head. But language has these like hard limitations of what it just can't do. Yet we're forced to write poetry to describe what is love. Well, it's kind of a bit like this. Yeah, you'll know it when you see it. It's sort of like that. We have to use these approximations, and this happens with remote viewing as well, in maybe just the same way, in that you get the use of physical metaphor to describe abstract concepts. And the viewer may very well be completely unaware that they are using a physical metaphor to describe an abstract concept, but they're actually explaining it really, really well. And they're like, well, I've described this table with these things on and blah, 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 blah. And, that wasn't the tasking, but it's really clear, after the fact, what's happened there. Where in our perceptual mechanism does this metaphor generating thing take place? So, maybe cryptids, UAPs, aliens, Bigfoot fairies, whatever, and Bigfoot fairies, all of those occurrences when they happen, maybe it's just like a remote viewer sitting there and making a analogy. But instead of being aware that you're doing that, it's happening automatically and you're perceiving, look, here's the best I got. So the Oz effect then, maybe these experiences happen instantaneously. And what the data says is there's a being moving very fast, it's animalistic, it's completely dark, and some part of your brain is like rendering that, like the graphics card in your PC, going, okay, now we can see the thing there because that's what's there. But you don't even know if that experience happened in real time, right? That could have been a flash of an event, and suddenly, when you look at a clock with a second hand, there's this known effect where when your eyes first land on the clock, the first time the hand ticks, it takes longer than the subsequent one. And you can notice this, just look at a clock with a second hand on, and you'll see this often. And the reason for that is because your eyes are blind when you move them about. I think they're called visual saccades or something. Your eyes constantly skitter about all over the place in order to build up a more complete picture. So when you move them to point them at the clock, you're completely blind, but you don't realize you're blind. So when your eye lands on the clock, you perceive it at 1 second to 12. But you're blind while your eyes are moving. What happens is that your brain backdates the imagery so that you perceive seeing the second hand there as happening during the time when you were blind. Right? It lies to you about time. So that's why the first second when you look at the clock seems longer, right? So there's nothing to say that if you had an experience like this, your mind couldn't backdate that perceptual experience and be like, yeah, this just happened. Trust me, bro. You wouldn't know.
Is this why we don't have videos of these things?
Maybe.
I guess we could always remote view it.
So, what if the Skinwalker legend itself is this phenomenon, David, that you're describing? What if the tribes that created this legend of the Skinwalker on Skinwalker Ranch were not able to come up with explanations for this strange phenomenon that does occur at this location? Because there are reports that it predates the curse, and out of this was born their way of explaining the phenomenon, and it formed this legend of the Skinwalker and Skinwalker Ranch, right? What if that's exactly what is going on, and we've just inherited this narrative of this explanation these people had previously, and now we're layering our own explanations on top with UFOs and dogmen and all these other things, right? I think that's definitely worth considering, is that not only did this phenomenon likely predate the curse, but that's how previous cultures and previous generations have manifested this phenomenon in their lore.
That makes total sense to me. I mean, psychic, perceptual, odd things is the shaman's job, right? So if bad psychic, perceptual, odd things are happening, then that's a bad shaman. Pretty straightforward logic, right? Or, we might call them an evil sorcerer. It's the same thing. Weird stuff's happening. We don't know why. The bad wizard did it. Mystery solved. Tune in next week when we cover.
Yeah, I think this is a good place to wrap it up. I think we give our thoughts about the backstory of the show itself with Skinwalker Ranch. We kind of went on several tangents. My own experience seeing something which I totally forgot about until just now when we started recording this. But hopefully that was an interesting little extra for everybody. But I do believe that this is probably going to be a subject that we revisit in the future. If those of our members, if you have something specific about Skinwalker that you think is really relevant to look at with remote viewing, to pull back the curtain on, please let us know. I'm sure we'll have a way for you to reach out to us through the website or on the members section. So do that. We will be assembling these, and if there's enough interest and enough of an interesting subject to take a look at, we definitely will. So, I mean, we only looked at one tiny aspect of this case, and there's a lot going on here that we could do. So, if it warrants it, we'll definitely do that for a future show. But thank you, Emily. Thank you, David, for joining me today on this After Hours and this podcast. I think this is where we're gonna end it. Anything final you wanted to add, Emily or David?
So, Brett, what if when you remote viewed the time traveling alien for this podcast, maybe some influence from Skinwalker Ranch traveled back in time to 2013 and ran across the desert. And that's why you've only just remembered this experience that you've totally forgotten about right now. That's the wildest speculation I can possibly conjure up.
I don't know about that one, but I mean, who knows at the end of the day? All they are is, even the remote viewing data, it's just an experience. It's an experience that in other instances has been shown to provide really accurate data. In this instance, it's really just a story. It's an interesting story. And even my personal experience in the high desert in Southern California of seeing that shape and hearing the story from my neighbor, it's just a story. So it's really up to the listener to use their own discernment to figure out how to make sense of that, whether it's valuable at all. But hopefully it was entertaining. So at least you got that.
So from my perspective, I'm really pleased with the tasking and with the results that we got in both David and Brett's sessions. I think we've got some really solid, at least session work. Whether or not, as Brett said, if it's true, we don't know. But I'm very pleased with how the sessions came out, and hopefully look forward to having more sessions on a number of topics in the shows ahead.
And that concludes our After Hours. We look forward to recording the next show for everybody, and we'll see you next time. Take care.